Nobody told us what they were. That was the part that stayed with me longest. Not what I saw, not what the other men saw. The silence after. It was February 1944, somewhere over the Rhine Valley at 27,000 feet. And I was the tail gunner on a B-17 named Lucky Enough. We had just come off the target run. Flak had torn through the left wing of the plane ahead of us, and she was trailing smoke and dropping altitude, and I was watching her, praying she held together long enough to make the channel. And that was when I saw them. Not German fighters. I knew German fighters. I had seen enough Messerschmitts to draw one from memory with my eyes closed. These were something else entirely. 3 of them, disc-shaped, perfectly silent against the engine roar, flying tight formation off our starboard wing like they had always been there. They did not fire. They did not signal. When they did not accelerate or climb or do anything that an aircraft under any kind of human control does when it finds itself in close proximity to an enemy formation. They simply flew with us, patient, deliberate, present. And then, before we crossed the coast back into friendly sky, they were gone. I have been trying to explain that for more than 30 years. I am no closer now than I was the day it happened. To understand why that matters, you need to understand the sky those men were living in. Because this was not a sky that had room in it for mystery. It was already full of things trying to kill you. They called it the Mighty Eighth. The 8th Air Force was based out of England, a collection of air bases spread across the flat counties of East Anglia. And from those bases, they flew east into Germany almost every day that the weather allowed. By the middle of the war, there were more than 200,000 American servicemen assigned to it. Bombers, fighters, ground crew, intelligence personnel, medics. An entire city of men pointed at the sky. The aircraft they flew most was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. If you have ever stood next to one in a museum, you know how large it is. You know the way it sits on the tarmac with a kind of stubborn, enormous weight, like it was built to survive things. At altitude in combat, it was cold enough inside the fuselage to freeze exposed skin in minutes. And the men who flew in them wore electrically heated suits over their uniforms and still lost fingers and toes to frostbite on long missions. The oxygen masks iced over. The guns jammed. At 25,000 feet over central Germany in January, the world outside the plexiglass was a blue-black so deep it looked like space. A crew chief at Bassingbourn named Kowalski used to say the same thing every time he watched a B-17 taxi to the runway. You know what that airplane is? The new ground crew would shake their heads. That airplane is a coffin with propellers. A beautiful, magnificent coffin. You take care of her and maybe she brings them home. You miss something, she doesn't. He was not being dramatic. That was just what it was. A tour of duty for an 8th Air Force crew was 25 missions. In 1943, the statistical probability of surviving all 25 was roughly 1 in 4. Men did the arithmetic themselves. They did it quietly, in their bunks, before missions, and they came to the same conclusion every time. And then they got up and flew anyway. That is the kind of men we are talking about. The German air defense system was called the Kammhuber line, and it was methodical and layered and lethal. Radar stations fed targeting information to anti-aircraft batteries on the ground, and those batteries fired shells that detonated at altitude in black clouds called flak. Flak did not care about courage. It did not care about skill. It was simply iron and fire distributed across the sky at the altitude where the bombers flew. And the bombers had to fly straight and level on the bomb run to hit their targets, which meant no evasive action, which meant flying directly into it. A bombardier from the 381st Bomb Group described it once to a younger crewman who had just arrived from stateside training and still had the look of someone who did not yet know what he had signed up for. What does the flak feel like? From inside the plane? The bombardier thought about it for a moment. You know when you are driving and you go over a railway crossing too fast? That bump, that jolt that goes up through the seat and into your spine? Yeah, like that. Except the bump is trying to kill you, and there are 100 of them, and you cannot slow down, and you cannot turn, and you just have to sit there and take it. The kid did not ask any more questions about flak after that. Above the flak waited the fighters. Focke-Wulf 190s, Messerschmitt 109s, inexperienced German pilots who had been flying combat since the early years of the war and knew every weakness of the B-17, knew where to attack from, knew how to work in coordinated groups to pull a bomber out of formation and bring it down. A bomber that fell out of formation was a bomber that died. The crew knew this. They flew in tight boxes for mutual protection, their gun fields overlapping. And still the fighters came, and still the bombers fell. By the end of the war, the 8th Air Force had suffered more than 47,000 killed in action. More American airmen died in the skies over Europe than Marines died in the entire Pacific theater. So when a B-17 crew told you they saw something unusual in the sky over Germany, you had to understand who was doing the telling. These were not excitable men. They were not men prone to fantasy or the kind of fear that makes you see things. And they had been stripped of all of that somewhere over their 3rd or 4th or 5th mission. What remained was a core of trained, exhausted, precise observation. When they said they saw something they could not explain, they meant it the same way they meant everything else. Flatly, carefully, without decoration. And they kept seeing it. The accounts did not begin with headlines or official reports. They began the way most true things begin. Quietly, between men who trusted each other, in the hours after they had landed and were still deciding what they had seen. The first reports did not arrive with urgency. They came in the way a man mentioned something he is still not sure about. Something he has been turning over in his mind for days before he finally says it out loud. Quietly, almost apologetically. As if the act of saying it made it more real than he was ready for. The year was 1943. A bald turret gunner from the 305th Bomb Group, a 21-year-old from rural Tennessee named Edward Reeves, was the first man whose account survived in enough detail to be worth sitting with. Reeves flew his 7th mission in October of that year. The target was an industrial complex outside Schweinfurt. If you know anything about the air war over Europe, you know that name. The mission that went there before Reeves came back with 60 bombers out of 291 destroyed. 60 bombers, 600 men, in a single afternoon. Reeves knew those numbers. Every man who climbed into a B-17 that October knew them. He told his story for the first time to a journalist in 1978, 35 years after it happened. And even then, he spoke the way a man speaks when he is choosing his words very carefully. Not because he wants to deceive you, but because he has spent decades trying to find the right ones and has never quite managed it. He said they were 2 hours into the return leg, somewhere over the Rhine, and when his crewmate in the waist position knocked twice on the fuselage beside the ball turret. That was the signal. Something worth looking at. Reeves rotated the turret. He scanned the formation. And there, off the port side, flying at the same altitude and the same speed as the formation, were 2 objects. Round, metallic in the way that catches light without reflecting it cleanly, the way a wet stone looks different from a dry one. No wings, no tail section, no exhaust trail. Just 2 shapes holding position in the sky as if the sky were the most natural place in the world for them to be. His first thought was that they were some kind of German secret weapon. His second thought was that if they were a German secret weapon, they were the quietest and most patient one he had ever heard of. Because they did nothing. They flew alongside. They matched the formation's every adjustment. And they watched, if something without visible eyes can be said to watch, and with a quality of attention that Reeves could feel even from inside his turret. He knocked on the fuselage above him. His waist gunner crouched down to the turret interphone. "You seeing those?" "I'm seeing them." "What are they?" "I don't know." "Should I call it in?" A pause, long enough that Reeves thought the interphone had cut out. Not yet. They watched for another 40 minutes. The objects held formation through 2 course corrections and 1 evasive turn around a patch of cloud, and then somewhere over Belgium, without acceleration, without any visible change in their behavior, they were simply gone. Not fast, not dramatic. Gone the way a word leaves your mouth. One moment present, the next moment not. Reeves filed nothing that day. There was no box on any form he had ever seen for what he had watched for 40 minutes over the Rhine Valley. Back at the base that evening, he sat in the mess with his pilot, a broad-shouldered Georgian named Willis, who had a reputation for saying exactly what he thought and nothing more. "You going to tell anyone?" Willis asked. Reeves wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. The coffee was bad, the way it always was, but it was hot and that was enough. "Tell them what exactly?" Willis stirred his coffee slowly. "Fair point." They sat with that for a while. And around them the mess was loud with the particular noise of men who had survived another day and were not entirely sure how. Nobody at the surrounding tables was talking about what Reeves and Willis were not talking about. But Reeves noticed, in the days that followed, that 2 of the other crews who had flown that mission were quieter than usual. Not shaken quiet, thinking quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a man is composing something in his head that he does not yet have the language for. The second account comes from a navigator named Harold Fitch, who flew with the 100th Bomb Group out of Thorpe Abbotts in Norfolk, a group so consistently devastated by German fighters that the other crews had taken to calling them the Bloody 100th. Fitch was a precise man by training and by nature. Navigation at altitude over enemy territory required a quality of mind that did not accommodate vagueness. You were either at the right coordinates or you were not. The sky did not negotiate. He saw them on 3 separate missions in 1944. Not the same objects necessarily. He was always careful to say that. But objects of the same description and the same behavior. Disc-shaped. Silent, as far as he could tell above the engine noise. Flying formation. Never hostile. Always leaving before the formation crossed a coastline back toward England. That last detail was the one that bothered him most. In a recorded interview from 1981, he said, "They always left before landfall. Every time. Not approximately before landfall. Before landfall. Like they knew exactly where the line was." He brought it up once with his pilot, a laconic Minnesotan named Strand, who had a habit of responding to alarming information with the minimum number of words necessary. "Strand," Fitch said, "those things are back." Strand looked out his window. He looked for a long time. Then he looked back at his instruments. "Yep. Same as before." "Yep." "You going to call it in?" Strand adjusted the throttle on the number 3 engine, which had been running slightly warm since they left the target. "Call what in?" It was not a question. Fitch understood that. He went back to his charts. That night on the ground, Fitch tried once more. And they were walking back from the debrief, boots on wet grass, the English sky doing what the English sky always did. "It doesn't bother you," Fitch said. It was not quite a question. Strand lit a cigarette and walked 3 more paces before he answered. "Everything up there bothers me, Fitch. I just pick what to think about." Fitch never raised it with him again. The pattern by the end of 1944 was consistent enough that it could no longer be called coincidence, even by men who very much wanted to call it coincidence. The objects appeared over Germany or occupied Europe. They flew formation with the bombers, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for the better part of an hour. They showed no aggression. They demonstrated a maneuverability that no aircraft of the period possessed, able to hold position in crosswinds that pushed the heavy bombers around like kites. And they always, without exception, departed before the formation reached friendly coastline, and nobody had an answer for the last part. It was the detail that sat at the back of every account like a splinter. Not what they were, not where they came from. Why did they always know when to leave? Some men tried to answer that question with words. Others tried something more direct. They reached for a camera. There is something you have to understand about cameras on a B-17. They were not supposed to be there. Personal cameras were against regulations, officially forbidden on combat missions for reasons that made sense on paper. Loose equipment was a hazard. Photographs could fall into enemy hands. The chain of command preferred that the only images coming off a mission were the ones taken by the aircraft's own automatic strike cameras, which were operated by nobody, and pointed only downward at the target and told you nothing about what flew beside you at altitude. But men brought cameras anyway. They always did. A small personal camera tucked inside a flight jacket, underneath the heated suit, close enough to the body to keep the shutter mechanism from seizing in the cold. They brought them because they were 22 years old, and they were flying over Europe, and some part of them, the part that had not yet been educated out of hope by combat, still believed they were going to survive and go home and show someone what it looked like up there. What the clouds looked like from above, what the formation looked like stretched out ahead of you in the winter light over Germany. That impulse, that very human and very ordinary impulse, is the reason we have any physical record at all. His name was Thomas Cassidy. He was a waist gunner with the 91st Bomb Group. He's based at Bassingbourn in Cambridgeshire. And he was 23 years old in the autumn of 1944 when he brought his personal Argus camera on a mission to Frankfurt and took the photograph that he would spend the rest of his life trying to get someone to take seriously. Cassidy was not a complicated man by his own account. He was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father worked in the steel industry. He had wanted to be a mechanic before the war, and he became one after it, running a small garage in western Pennsylvania until he retired. When he told his story, and he told it many times over many decades, he told it the same way every time, with the same details, in the same order. People who knew Cassidy said he never embellished anything in his life, not even fishing stories. On the mission to Frankfurt, he saw the object during the return leg. It came in from the starboard side and settled into a position off the wing, perhaps 300 yards out, perhaps less. He described it as perfectly round, the color of brushed aluminium, catching the autumn light in a way that made it look almost warm. No markings, no seams that he could see, no movement of any kind on its surface. He had his camera inside his jacket. He pulled it out. His hands were shaking, he said, but not from fear, from the cold. His heated gloves had malfunctioned somewhere over the target, and 2 fingers on his right hand had gone from painful to numb, to something beyond numb that he had decided not to think about. He worked the camera with stiff fingers and shot 4 frames before the object moved off and was gone. He landed at Bassingbourn and went through the standard post-mission debrief without mentioning the object or the photographs. He said it felt like the kind of thing you held on to until you understood it better. The way you do not tell a doctor about a symptom until you have decided it is real. 2 days later, he made his mistake. He mentioned it to another gunner in his barracks, a man named Purcell, who had been on the same mission and had seen nothing unusual, and said so with the particular confidence of a man who takes pride in not seeing unusual things. Word moved quickly in a barracks. So by that evening, a sergeant had asked Cassidy to report to the intelligence office. The officer behind the desk was a captain whose name Cassidy never learned or never remembered. Young, neat, the kind of calm that comes from authority rather than temperament. You took photographs during the mission. It was not a question, but Cassidy answered it anyway. Yes, sir. Of the unidentified object you reported to Sergeant Purcell? Yes, sir. 4 frames. I don't know if any of them came out. My hands were pretty cold. The captain held out his hand across the desk. The camera, please. Cassidy set it on the desk. At least one of them came out, the captain said, without looking up from a folder he had opened. We had it developed this morning. Cassidy felt something move through him that he described 30 years later as the opposite of relief. Can I see it? No. It's my camera. The camera will be returned to you. The film has been retained. What was in the photograph? The captain looked at him for the first time since the conversation began. His expression was not unkind. It was something more unsettling than unkind. It was the expression of a man who has already decided what this conversation is and is simply waiting for it to be over. You are not to discuss what you reported with other personnel. Not your crew, not ground staff, not anyone. Is that understood? Cassidy said it was understood. He got his camera back the following afternoon. The film had been removed. In its place, someone had loaded a fresh roll, still sealed in its paper wrapper, as if offering him a clean start. He never took another photograph on a mission. Cassidy's story was not unique. It was a template. The sighting, the camera, the debrief, the silence. Across multiple bases and multiple bomb groups, the sequence repeated itself with a consistency that, by itself, told you something. But there was one crew whose encounter went further than any of the others. One mission that lasted long enough and was witnessed by enough men that no amount of silence could entirely contain it. The mission on February 24th, 1944, was supposed to be straightforward. That word gets used a lot in accounts of the air war over Europe, and it never means what it sounds like. Straightforward meant the target was known, the route was planned, the weather window was acceptable, and the losses were expected to fall within a range that the people who planned these things had decided was operationally sustainable. It did not mean safe. Nothing about it was ever safe. It just meant that on paper, in a room in England the night before, it had looked like something that could be done. The crew of a B-17 called Paper Doll had heard that word before. They had heard it 11 times, once for each mission they had completed. And they had learned to receive it the way you receive any information whose relationship to reality is largely theoretical. They noted it. They moved on. They checked their equipment and tried to sleep, and in the morning, they flew. There were 10 of them. The pilot was a 26-year-old from Akron, Ohio, named Robert Garrett, who had the particular quality of stillness under pressure that made other men want to be near him when things went wrong. His co-pilot was a Texan named Hess, who compensated for his own fear with a steady output of quiet, dry observations that were not quite jokes. but functioned like them. The navigator, bombardier, radio operator, flight engineer, and 4 gunners completed the crew. They had been together long enough to have stopped introducing themselves to new personnel as individuals. They introduced themselves as Paper Doll. They took off from Podington at 0630 into a sky the color of old pewter and climbed east toward a cloud ceiling that broke apart at 12,000 feet and gave way to the hard, frozen clarity of high-altitude winter. By the time they crossed the Dutch coast, they were at 26,000 feet, and the temperature inside the fuselage had dropped to -35. Yet the number 2 engine was pulling slightly rough, had been since the channel, and Garrett had made the calculation that it would hold and filed the calculation away and did not revisit it. There was enough to think about. The flak over the target was heavy and accurate in the specific way that accurate flak is, which is to say that it appeared to know something about where you were going before you got there. 3 bombers in the group ahead went down on the bomb run. Paper Doll took a fragment through the nose section that missed the bombardier by a distance he later described as approximately the width of his own hand. The bombs went away clean. Garrett brought the aircraft around onto the return heading and pushed the throttles up and pointed them toward England and told himself, as he told himself every time, that the hard part was over. The hard part was never over until the wheels touched down at Podington, when they had been on the return leg for perhaps 40 minutes, when the tail gunner, a compact and exceptionally calm young man from Baltimore named Cruz, came over the interphone with a particular tone of voice that the crew had learned to pay attention to. Not alarm, not the clipped urgency of a fighter call. Something quieter than that. Something that, in its very quietness, was more arresting than a shout. Pilot, tail. You need to hear something. Garrett keyed his mic. Now go ahead, Cruz. We have company. Starboard side. High. Keeping pace. Garrett looked out his side window. The formation stretched ahead of him and to the left. To the right, the sky was the particular shade of deep blue that exists only at altitude in winter. So dark it made your eyes ache to look at it directly. And there, against that blue holding position off the starboard wing at perhaps 200 yards, was something that Robert Garrett would spend the next 30 years of his life trying to describe accurately and never quite managing to. It was large. That was the first thing. Larger than he expected something to be when it was this close and this quiet. He estimated it later at perhaps 60 feet across, though he acknowledged that estimating size against a featureless sky at altitude is close to impossible. It was disc-shaped, flattened on the bottom, slightly domed on top. The surface a dull silver that caught the winter light without throwing it back. It sat in the air with a solidity, a physical confidence that no aircraft he had ever seen possessed. Aircraft fought to stay in the air. They vibrated and strained and pushed against gravity with everything they had. This thing simply was in the air, the way a stone is in a river, present and permanent and utterly unbothered. Hess saw it at the same moment from the right seat. Bob, I see it. What is it? I don't know. Is it German? Garrett watched it for 3 full seconds before he answered, which in a cockpit at altitude under any kind of stress is a very long time. No. How do you know? Because I know what German looks like. Hess said nothing for a moment. It's keeping our speed exactly. I know. Our exact speed, Bob. Not approximately. I know, Hess. The interphone opened up across the aircraft. The waist gunners had it in sight. The ball turret reported a second object, smaller, below and to the right, that nobody in the cockpit had noticed. The bombardier, still in the nose with a piece of flak the width of his hand lodged in the plexiglass 3 inches from where his head had been 20 minutes ago, said something that was half prayer and half profanity, and then said it again, more quietly. Crews came back on from the tail. "Pilot, tail, there's a third one. Port side high. You won't see it from up front." Garrett processed this. Three. Are they doing anything? A pause while crews watched. "No, sir. They are just watching." There is a specific human experience that has no clean name. The experience of being observed by something whose intentions you cannot read and whose capabilities you cannot assess, and which is under no obligation to explain itself to you. Every person in the crew of Paper Doll was having that experience simultaneously at 26,000 feet over Germany on the afternoon of February 24th, 1944, and not one of them reached for a gun. That detail is worth sitting with. These were trained gunners with loaded weapons in a sky where everything unfamiliar was assumed to be trying to kill them. They watched. They did not fire. Later, when asked why, Cruz said it most plainly. "It never felt like a threat," he said. "It felt like something else entirely. I couldn't tell you what. Just not a threat." They flew like that for 51 minutes. Garrett knew the duration because he was watching the clock the way pilots watch clocks, automatically, recording time the way other people record words. 51 minutes of formation flying with 3 objects that had no business being in any sky that Garrett understood. The number 2 engine continued to run rough, and he continued to manage it, and somewhere in the absurdity of that, managing a rough engine while 3 unidentifiable objects flew escort on his aircraft, he found something close to a grim sense of humor about the whole situation. He told Hess this. Hess looked at him the way you look at a man who might be losing his grip. "You find this funny?" "I find it something," Garrett said. "Funny is the closest word I've got right now." The objects never varied their position, never accelerated, never signaled anything that the crew could interpret as communication or aggression or curiosity or anything else they had a word for. They flew. They watched. The formation ground westward across Belgium, across the last of occupied Europe, toward the gray water of the English Channel. And then, as if a decision had been made by something none of them could see, they left. Not fast. That is what everyone said afterward, and it was the detail that undid every conventional explanation. A fast departure could have been a conventional aircraft at extreme throttle, could have been a misidentification, could have been explained away by someone sitting in a room in England with a folder and a set of alternative interpretations ready. But they did not leave fast. The 3 objects simply ceased to maintain formation. They fell back, without drama, without acceleration, almost without any visible means of propulsion changing, and within perhaps 15 seconds, they were no longer visible. Not gone over the horizon, not climbing out of sight, simply no longer there. Garrett stared at the place where the starboard object had been for a long moment. The interphone was completely silent. It stayed silent for almost a full minute, which on a 10-man aircraft interphone in a combat zone is not a natural state. It is the sound of 10 men independently deciding what they are and are not going to say about what just happened. It was Hess who finally broke it. He looked out the window one more time at the empty sky, then back at his instruments. Then he reached forward and made a small adjustment to the trim and settled back into his seat. "You going to put that in the report?" he said. Garrett thought about what happened to men who put certain things in reports. "I'm going to put that we completed the mission and returned without incident," he said. Hess nodded slowly. "Without incident," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. "Without incident," Garrett said again. Neither of them spoke again until the wheels touched down at Podington. But landing did not end it. For the crew of Paper Doll and for the men who debriefed them, what came next on the ground would prove in its own way just as strange as what had happened in the sky. They debriefed at Podington the same evening, the way they always did. A long table, hot coffee that was never quite hot enough, an intelligence officer with a form and a pen, and the particular professional patience of a man trained to listen without reacting. The crew of Paper Doll sat down and gave their account of the mission in the standard order. Target, flak, fighter activity, battle damage, crew status. Garrett reported the fragment through the nose section. He reported the rough number 2 engine. He reported that they had completed the mission and returned without incident. The intelligence officer wrote it all down without looking up. Afterward, walking back across the field in the dark, the radio operator, a quiet and methodical man from Cincinnati named Aldrich, fell into step beside Garrett and spoke without looking at him. "You didn't say anything?" "No." "About what we saw?" "No." Aldrich walked another few paces. "The others won't either," he said. "I already asked." Garrett looked up at the English sky, which was low and featureless and revealed nothing. Good. But someone talked. Someone always talked. Not out of carelessness or bravado, but out of the simple human need to hand an unbearable thing to another person for a moment, to see if they can hold it, to find out if it is as heavy as it feels. 3 weeks after the February mission, a ground crew mechanic at Podington wrote a letter home to his brother in Maryland describing something a pilot had told him, something about lights over Germany that flew alongside the bombers and then vanished. The letter was intercepted by military sensors, as all letters were. The mechanic was questioned. The pilot he had spoken to was identified, called in, and reminded formally and in writing of his obligations under the relevant security protocols. The written reminder went into a file. The file joined other files. The files went somewhere that files go when the people who created them would prefer they did not circulate. What we know is that between 1943 and 1945, the 8th Air Force generated dozens of incident reports describing unidentified aerial objects observed by bomber crews over occupied Europe. We know this because a small number of those reports survived. Declassified partially, reluctantly, decades later, with names redacted and details missing, and the clear impression of a document that had been edited by someone who understood exactly what they were removing. One report, dated March 1944, described an object that had been observed on 7 separate missions by 3 different bomb groups over a period of 6 weeks. The final line of the report, beneath a recommendation section that had been blacked out entirely, read simply, "Origin unknown. Behavior inconsistent with known aircraft of any nation. No further action recommended at this time." No further action recommended at this time. Someone wrote that. Someone read it, agreed with it, signed it, and filed it away. And for a very long time, that was the end of it. Except, of course, it was not the end of it. It never is, with things like this. The files disappear, but the men do not. The men go home and they grow old, and they carry it. And eventually, whether in a recorded interview or letter to a son or a conversation at a bar 40 years after the war, they say it out loud one more time. Because that is what people do with things they cannot resolve. They keep returning to them. They keep asking. I want to leave the theories alone. You have heard enough theories. Everyone who touches this subject eventually drowns in theories, and by the time they surface, the story itself is gone, replaced by argument. What I keep coming back to is something simpler than a theory. It is this. These were not impressionable men. They were not men who needed the sky to be more interesting than it already was. The sky was already trying to kill them every time they entered it. They had no appetite for additional strangeness. They had no incentive to invent it, report it, carry it home, and spend the next 30 or 40 years of their civilian lives returning to it in interviews and letters and quiet conversations with people they trusted. And yet they did. All of them. Every one. Robert Garrett gave his last interview on the subject in 1987. He was 69 years old. The interviewer asked him at the end whether he had ever arrived at an explanation. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "but I stopped needing one a long time ago." He paused. "What I never stopped needing was for someone to believe that it happened. I believe it happened. If you have a story of your own, you know where to find me. I will see you next time."